one critical thing with any restoration project is, or there's a few critical things, but one critical thing is identifying at the outset what is in your control, what is in your influence, and what you can't control. Now, and also through time, what can you put in your control? You know that you can come down and you have control over things like planting trees. You know, you can do things on your own property. You can bring a machine down if you want. You can do things. There's some things in your control, and there's a good likelihood of success of doing those things. There are things within your influence that might benefit your project. You know, going to the two-headed people across the river and trying to convince them to form a land care group is within your influence, if not your control. But if you have that influence and they do something, it's going to benefit your site here as well. You know, dealing with councils, going on council committees, talking to their local land service. So try to influence as well. And then there are things you just got to accept they're going to happen. The floods are outside your control, broadly. Fires, droughts, alien invasion, climate change, all these impacts are beyond your control, but that doesn't mean you can't plan for them. So what I'm getting at here is planning is actually really important. A lot of groups have started with a lot of enthusiasm, done a lot of work, and lost enthusiasm as things go wrong. And so good planning will identify early on what is possible, what is likely, your priorities, how to stage things, but also where you can't mitigate against things that are going to be damaging, accepting those. So knowing that, especially on riverbank projects, you are going to have a lot of setbacks. And knowing that from the very beginning just makes it part and parcel of the journey. And you know what I'm getting at is I've seen groups start enthusiastically coming down planting trees, and they get washed away. Okay, we'll come down and plant them again. They get washed away, and each time there's fewer and fewer people wanting to get into it because they don't think it's possible to do. And so that good planning, mitigation wherever possible, using long stem planting mitigates the risk of plants being washed away. You know, looking at all those things you can do, either control or influence, to make your job easier, will also help maintain group momentum, group enthusiasm, and also that feeling of success. And it can be boring as batshit, planning and monitoring, but groups that do it, and even at a site level, knowing that you're progressing towards what your goal is, and being able to, and knowing how you're progressing, is actually really good with maintaining your own commitment and enthusiasm. But there's a few things that really impact on restoring a riverbank. Primarily, weeds. Weeds are the biggest impact you'll find in trying to restore a riverbank. I mean, here you've been really lucky to get the local land service grant, but I'll bet you $10 to a minty, this soil is full of weed seed. You're going to get castor oils coming back up. Next time there's a little flood, you're going to get the Tradescantia coming back up. You're going to get cestrum, you're going to get willows, probably get arundo, donax coming up occasionally. So weeds are your biggest challenge. Now, weed ecology, understanding how weeds work, is actually quite important to understanding how you tackle weeds. Weeds are weeds because, I mean, there's the old definition, weeds is a plant out of place. In restoration, that's true as well, but they're also much more annoying in restoration projects, I find. Weeds like high disturbance environments. Weeds do better than native plants because they can exploit the degraded environment. They can exploit a disturbed environment much better than the native plants. So they establish faster. When you get erosion or slumping, it's usually weeds that come up first. So the best way to prevent that happening is not have any weeds. So that's a long-term landscape scale concept. But even at site level, it means that every time there's a bit of a flood, or even every year, just program in some time to take out any establishing weeds. So once you've tackled them, it's much easier to keep the population low when they're just coming back in, rather than waiting for them to start setting seed again. Weeds also like high nutrient environments. Riverbanks are generally high nutrient environments. Probably not quite across there because it's all sandy, but this side, which is a bit more loamy, there's a fair bit of nutrient in the soil here. Weeds, the weed species that we have here tend to do really well in that high nutrient environment. Weeds have a certain behavioural characteristics that give them advantage over native plants. Most species are what we call outbreeding species, that they tend to avoid mating with themselves or their close relatives. So a lot of native plants, casuarinas are wind pollinated, but the wind flows up and down valleys, so the pollen travels kilometres, tens of kilometres. A lot of the rainforest species are berries, so the birds eat them and they'll crap out the seed kilometres away, or bats will take them kilometres away. So you're getting genes mixing all the time. A lot of native plants have the concept that the male and female parts are fertile at different times, or active at different times. So the pollen, they might have pollen in the morning, but they might be receptive to the pollen in the afternoon, so they don't self-fertilize, or it produces self-fertilizing. Weeds, on the other hand, tend to be inbreeding species. So they will quite readily pollinate themselves, and the seeds will be viable, and you don't get the problems of inbreeding. So a lot of outbreeding species, as they start inbreeding, you end up with characteristics that you'd like with humans. You get genetic faults popping up. With weeds, you don't get that. So a single weed seed can form a whole population of viable weeds. Weeds tend to have very short generation times. If they establish, they'll start putting out lots of seed very quickly, and so they can exploit any empty space and take it over. Weeds tend to produce lots of seeds. So compared to plants, say a large-leaf privet, which likes growing along rivers, versus a say lily pilly. Now, a lily pilly might have 10,000 berries on a mature lily pilly every summer. A large leaf privet can produce 2 million seeds a year. Most weed species produce a lot of seeds very quickly, and so any empty space can get taken up by the weeds. Weeds are often what we call ecological engineers. They have characteristics that suppress other plants around them. So that can be chemical. There's this concept called allelopathy, which basically comes down to poisoning the soil. Weeds will actually release chemicals in the soil which stops the germination of other plants, and that can stop native regeneration. So things like cestrum, you've all smelt cestrum. When those leaves drop to the soil and rot, they make it difficult for other plants to germinate. A lot of weeds physically suppress other plants, so they might produce pure shade. So you'll often see privet or camphor forming stands where nothing can grow underneath because it is just so dark. Weeds often have characteristics that will kill other plants. So balloon vine here, balloon vine will climb up a tree, cover the canopy so that the native tree doesn't get any light, and it can produce so much weight it can pull mature trees down. So weeds are intrinsically evil, is what I'm trying to say. They have all these characteristics and functions that actually favour the environment, so to change the environment to favour themselves, and that's why we call them ecological engineers. There are some advantages to leaving some weeds, and in terms of tactics. Say, for example, and I'll use an urban example at the moment, having lantana below houses. So in urban areas, you've often got nutrients, the house on top of the hill, and nutrients and water flow down the hill into the bush and cause weed infestation. Having lantana behind the houses does two things. It soaks up the nutrients and stops any weed seeds that are coming down from the houses going into the bush. So often in bush regeneration, what we'll do is we'll regenerate the creeks and up to the lantana, wait for that bush to become really well established, then we'll take out the lantana, often while educating the landowners about taking out weeds on their property and not overwatering and stuff like that. So you can actually have some advantage with weeds. It depends on the species. Things like poplars, they take up space and that's about it. They're not creating huge problems. That the roots are having some benefit. They're producing shade for the water. I wouldn't take out the poplars till very late in the piece. But things like willows, gladitsia, arundo, you look at the risk profile of what that weed is doing in sight. If it's going to create more problems, you would want to potentially take it out earlier. But then again, you might not want to take them out over the whole length of the riverbank and have your bank collapse. You might think, if you're doing a 10-metre section of revegetation, take out every weed there, then leave a patch of weeds, then do another 10 metres of clearing and revegetation. As that native revegetation grows, you might then take out the intervening weeds. But if they're really high-risk weeds, you might want to take them out straight away. Things like arundo, once it's established, it's really hard to get rid of. It's called false bamboo. It grows a lot in the upper Hunter. You see a lot of it around Tokal as well. It kind of looks like a bamboo. You can also do stuff that disadvantages weeds. So sometimes you might not need to take them out. So especially herbaceous weeds, through time, if you establish native canopy, that will get shaded out. Native plants also produce these chemicals, and have allelopathic effects, especially eucalypts. So through time, if you're doing revegetation on a riverbank, you might not try to establish every strata at one hit, because until your native trees grow up, these weed grasses are going to have competitive advantage over native grasses. And so you might establish the canopies first, mid-story, and then as the shade comes up and the soil profile and the soil chemistry and the soil biology changes, then you might try to establish broadly all your native herbaceous species. That's not saying that you might not want to put in things like lomandras and sedges in some areas, or if you can maintain them, have these little core areas where you might actually plant everything, as long as you've got the resources to maintain it. But understanding that if you tried to do a large-scale planting over a couple of 100 meters with all your native grasses, chances are most of them are going to die. So you might want to just plant 5 by 5 meters of all the native grasses, so you can come down and keep it weeded, and then through time, just spray around the edge so that can spread out further and further. And then as the shade comes in, they'll take off, and the weed grasses will be disadvantaged. So there's a few things you can do to disadvantage weeds. Again, not a river example, but I once did a bush regeneration project in southern Sydney, in Bardwell Valley, and it was a pure stand of privet, small leaf privet, and from the edge it grew all the way down to the ground. So it's a wall of green, and once you worked your way into it, you're like in a cathedral. It was like a cavern of green. It was beautiful to be in, and all we did to get rid of it was that we cleared the privet at either end, upwind and downwind ends of the valley, and that allowed air movement in, because the wall of green was stopping any air coming in. Opening up the ends allowed air to flow through, which dried out the soil, which pretty much disadvantaged the privet to the point they weren't flowering and producing much seed. And so we reduced the threat just through a simple action like that. And you'll find that there are some things you can do on riverbanks to do that. So but mostly it is shading. So mostly it's establishing the canopy species. You're never going to get rid of all weeds. So as you learn to love your erosion, you might have to learn to love some weed species. So you're never going to get back to a totally pre-European landscape. But you're trying to aim for leaving the weeds that aren't going to create problems and cause the site to degrade the minute you walk away from it.